When we think about the Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean, we usually think that these navigators were just taking spices from India to resell in Europe. But what few people know is that the Portuguese established a true monopoly in that ocean. So sailing those seas without a license issued by the Portuguese crown was a huge risk of having your ships sunk or seized. And this immediately raises a series of questions for us, like, after all, how did so few Portuguese manage to monopolize the Indian Ocean? How did this license system work? And why didn't the Indians, with such a large population, expel the navigators? How did they conquer Asia's largest cities in the 16th century? And how did the Portuguese manage to literally close off an entire ocean to prevent navigation to the Middle East? In today's video, we'll discuss the conquest of the Indian Ocean and the use of iron and fire. Diplomacy and cunning made the Portuguese the masters of an entire ocean for more than 100 years in the 16th century. But before we start the video, if you like our content, become a member of our channel right now. That way, you'll have access to our group and exclusive content, including live classes. To delve even deeper into the behind the scenes of history, the beginning of Portuguese dominance over the Indian Ocean started with their arrival in this ocean in 1498. Navigator Vasco da Gama, following Prince Dom Henrique from the early 15th century. The Portuguese, little by little, sailed along the African coast, always studying the existing winds and currents to try to make the passage around the continent toward Asia. Meanwhile, along the way, they maintained contact with African civilizations and established markers and standards to guide the progress achieved for other navigators. And after managing to round the Cape of Storms, renamed the Cape of Good Hope, the Portuguese, with Vasco da Gama, reached Asia, establishing for the first time a diplomatic representation with the Indian kingdoms. However, the reaction of the Indians is not one of welcome, but rather of distrust. At that time, the Indian territory was not unified, but subdivided into a series of kingdoms and autonomous territories that were rivals among themselves, with the Portuguese landing in the territory of the Samarim of Calicut. At first, they were cordial, aiming to make good trade agreements and take spices, but the Indian leader was not impressed by the goods brought by the Portuguese. The cloths and products could be found there in even better quality. And so Vasco returns to Portugal with some spices, but not with all that he could have brought. However, even though some ships were lost, the expedition is considered a complete success for proving that it was possible to reach India by sailing around Africa. The Portuguese accomplished the feat of crossing half the globe in wooden ships, navigating by the stars and mapping the world, to trade with a completely unknown people. This inspired Camões to write the Lusíads, detailing Vasco da Gama's journey to India, helped and hindered by the gods of Olympus, who conspired in his mission to spread Christianity worldwide. And Vasco da Gama made an agreement with the Samarim of Calicut to leave some Portuguese there so they could establish a trading post and set up a point of commerce, since he and his men would return several more times in the future. That's because spices had extremely high resale value in Europe, with just a few grams of some being worth almost as much as gold. Unlike how we usually imagine them as seasonings, spices were used as medicine, just like they still are today, with anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and relaxing teas. So, the spice expeditions were not journeys in search of seasoning, but in search of medicine. It was the seafaring pharmaceutical industry, with all its monetary power. However, despite the good deal made with the Zamorin of Calicut, the reality turned out to be much worse than expected. After returning to Portugal in 1500, King Dom Manuel sent a new fleet of 13 ships, led by Pedro Álvares Cabral, filled with gold, jewels, and gifts to trade for Indian spices. This fleet deviated from its route and discovered Brazil on April 22, 1500. But when he arrived in India, Cabral discovered that the Portuguese, left there by Vasco to build a trading post had been killed. With the complacency of the Samarin, Cabral managed to get authorization from the Samarin to build the trading post himself, with the Indian leader promising protection. But in the midst of this, Cabral's crew was also attacked by Islamic merchants, with many Portuguese, including Pedro Vaz de Caminha, dying in the attack. And even with Cabral returning to Portugal with only 4 ships out of the 13 that set sail, the expedition was still highly profitable. When Cabral returns to Portugal, he tells Dom Manuel about the attack on his men and that Vasco da Gama's crew was killed by order of the Zamorin. And upon hearing this, Vasco da Gama asked King Dom Manuel if he himself could lead a fleet to India. But unlike his first fleet, which was for trade, or Cabral's, which was diplomatic, not to become an Indian leader, but to make an Indian leader, but to make Indian. Remove repeated phrases, preserve proper names, keep speaker's perspective, maintain original meaning, reduce wordiness. Unlike Emmanuel Cabra, who is still not becoming an Indian leader, Cabra still manages to become one. But in fact, it is only known nowadays that he was the discoverer of Brazil. Due to a significant 19th century historical investigation led by Emperor Dom Pedro II and Vasco da Gama. On this mission across the world, he bombards Calicut, causing chaos and terror in Indian cities. In addition, he orders the assault on every pilgrim ship bound for Mecca, commanding that they be set on fire and everyone on board be killed, unless they agreed to convert to Christianity. Vasco da Gama's ferocity towards the Indians was, above all, a response to the Samarim, who always pretended to be friendly and then allowed the killing of foreigners. And so, Vasco uses massacres and ferocity to impose fear and respect, and to make the Samarim negotiate this while he also negotiates with the Samarim's enemy, the Raja of Cochin, Vasco. He manages in India to keep trading with the Samarim's main enemy. Through diplomacy and friendship, he even secures a trading post from him, based on fear and the respect earned through terror on one hand and diplomacy on the other. The Portuguese managed to establish a viceroyalty for themselves, with many trading posts in the Asian seas, practically dominating the spice trade in the Indian Ocean. And King Dom Manuel takes advantage of the situation and sends one of the greatest generals in the history of Portugal, Dom Afonso de Albuquerque, to India. Afonso's mission was not to conquer India, but rather to completely close the spice market to the Asian market. Thus, besides Portugal monopolizing trade with the West, it would also make trade with the Mediterranean as difficult as possible. The Ottomans did this by entering via the Arabian Sea and reselling to the Venetians. Afonso captures the Strait of Hormuz and builds a fortress to control the Arabian Sea in 1515. This was after already closing the southeastern Indian Ocean through the conquest of Malacca, where about 1,000 Portuguese conquered one of the main cities of Southeast Asia in 1511. And through the conquest of Malacca, the Portuguese were able to reach the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, as well as travel by sea to China, where they would later establish the port of Macau. And also through Malacca, they closed an important gateway to access the Indian Ocean. But if something made Portuguese success possible in those seas, it was the great competence of their leaders, the fervor in battle, and their military superiority. In 1509, the Viceroy Francisco de Almeida, to avenge the death of his own son. The Indians, with just over 17 ships, defeated at the Battle of Diu a fleet 12 times larger, thanks to Portuguese military superiority, with bigger and better ships capable of firing more and at greater distances. According to Charles Boxer in Portuguese Maritime Empire, the fleet gathered in Diu. It was the Islamic world's final chance to respond to Portuguese maritime dominance. And their defeat made the Portuguese reign uncontested in those seas. The Portuguese began consolidating their presence along the Indian and African coasts. With the construction of fortresses and ports, we can mention the fortress of Sofala and Mozambique, and the historic alliance achieved with the Sultan of Melinde. And this along with the significant conquest of Goa, which stayed under Portuguese rule for 450 years before India took it in the 1960s, about 60 years ago. And with that, they began to develop the implementation of a poster control system. Basically, the Portuguese started issuing a safe conduct pass so that ships could sail through the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese were interested in preventing goods from entering through the Arabian Sea and reaching Mediterranean ports by ships pretending to be allies. And this system was implemented. Sometimes Portuguese people would even join expeditions led by foreign crowns. We can mention the expedition of Fernão de Magalhães and Sebastião de Elcano, with Magalhães being Portuguese and bringing many Portuguese crew members with him. The Spanish managed to evade the patrol ships that came to check the origin of that Western ship in Asian waters. Thus, through the use of passes, the approach became more impersonal, with the Lusitanians managing to impose official licensing of ships that could transport goods and merchandise through the Indian Ocean. And in 1570, they began to implement the policy of passes in Southeast Asia as well, with the response from the alliance between the Ottomans and the Sultan of Sumatra, who, besides being an enemy of the Portuguese, was also a major producer of spices. Gradually, the pass system collapsed. The Iberian-Portuguese-Dutch War ended up weakening Portuguese power in the Indian and Pacific Oceans more and more. The Dutch took a lacquer, helped the Shintoists expel the Jesuits and Portuguese from Japan, and then they joined with local Hindu leaders to expel the Portuguese from Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka. And in this way, we can see the extent of Portuguese power in the Indian Ocean. Unlike the idea that the Portuguese only transported spices back and forth, they did much more than that. For almost 100 years, they completely dominated an ocean half a world away, being responsible for controlling who traveled through those waters and who bought spices. Through diplomacy, iron, fire, and blood, the Portuguese managed to establish themselves as one of the greatest world powers of the 16th century, worthy of dividing half the globe with Castile and dominating the main routes toward the known and unknown world. Did you know about these facts? What surprised you the most? So leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of our channel right now. That way, you'll be able to dive deeper and learn even more about the impressive Iberian history